I just want to say good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our webinar, Adapting Digital Standards, Empowering Small, Volunteer and Community Groups. And this is the third in a series of 4 webinars, which will take place on a Tuesday lunchtime. My name is Audrey Wilson. I'm the Partnership and Engagement Manager at the Scottish Council on Archives. And I'll be your chair for today's session. So on behalf of everyone involved, I'd like to extend a warm welcome and a huge thank you to all of you for joining us today. So the Scottish Council on Archives and the Community Archives Heritage Group Scotland are working with Our Heritage, Our Stories, a project based at the University of Glasgow and is part of the Arts and Humanities Research Centre's TANK programme. That's towards a national collection, which actually will end in January in 2025. So today's webinar will be exploring the digital repository of Ireland's guide to archiving digital records for volunteer and community groups, which has been co-created by archival practice experts and using person-centred approaches that have been devised through the DRI, that's the Digital Record of Ireland, we'll call it DRI from now on in, their Community Archive Scheme training resources. You'll find out more about that. So the DRI is a certified trustworthy digital repository that provides long-term preservation and access to Ireland's social and cultural digital data. We will hear from 2 speakers. The first one is Dr. Maeve O'Brien, a membership manager at the DRI. She's got a background in academia and community development with a passion for digital preservation of community archives. We will then hear from Claire Lanigan from Clare Memories, a community archive founded in 2019 that collects and safeguards the oral history and folklore of County Clare in Ireland. A couple of very quick housekeeping messages. We are recording this session, so please do switch off your camera if you do not want to be identified. And I don't think we will be putting in the chat into the recording that will be available on the Scottish Council on Archives YouTube channel. We have enabled closed captioning for this session, and you can access it by going to the icon at the bottom of your screen called More, and then just clicking on Captions. So as this webinar is being recorded, you won't need to take lots of notes. You can sit back and relax, and we will be sending out the link afterwards to you anyway. We do encourage you to use the chat room, ask your questions, comment on anything, because this is a great opportunity for you to get to know the other people in this session. So without any more from me, I'm going to pass over to Maeve, and I hope you enjoy the session. Thanks.
Thanks so much, folks. Just delighted to be here this morning. Thank you so much for inviting us to give this talk, and I hope that you'll excuse my bunged up voice this morning. I think a lot of us are suffering with the effects of the cold weather. I'll just share my screen, folks, and let me know if you can see this all okay. That's great. Thank you very much. Yeah, so just delighted to be here this morning. Folks, I have a lot of very fond memories myself. Spent time in Scotland. I studied at the University of Glasgow and spent a wild winter out in the Outer Hebrides on Harris not too many years ago as well. So Scotland's very much in my heart, and it's great to be here today to deliver this presentation. So I'll just get straight into it. Again, if you have any questions or queries, feel free to pop them into the chat, and really looking forward to hearing from Claire Lanigan as well after I've given my presentation. So I'll just give you a very brief summary of the Digital Repository of Ireland, who we are, what we do. We are a digital archive, a digital repository. So that really means that we are in the business of long-term preservation of digital objects, whether that be digitized material for example, atlases or assizes or documents from history that have been scanned and ingested into the repository to born digital content. And that can be everything ranging from Word documents to TikTok videos. We are domain specific, so we primarily preserve culture, heritage, humanities, and social science objects. And we have a variety of funders, and we're supported by the Irish government in our endeavours. We've already touched on this a little in our intro, but we're a trustworthy digital repository and we are Core Trust Seal certified. So the repository itself reflects the core characteristics of trustworthy data repositories. And I'd really urge you to have a wee look on the website dri.ie and view the repository. We've some fantastic collections in there that have a lot of correlations, particularly with Scotland as well. I'd be a big advocate for Ulster Scots vernacular and poetry and things like that. Really hoping to get more content related to that in the repository as well. Everything in the repository adheres to the FAIR data principles. Therefore, all the materials are findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And that really means that by affixing, metadata to objects, they're sort of in conversation with other objects. So you might click metadata about County Clare, for example. You'll find some of Clare's fantastic pieces and oral history recordings, but you'll also find other objects and items that have been labelled with County Clare. And that really corresponds to sort of the interoperability and the findability and accessibility of the data in the repository. Each object in our repository is given a persistent identifier, a DOI, and this is an unchanging link to an open web accessible page. And in the case of the DRI, the digital object within the repository. And we generate these DOIs in collaboration with the British Library. The path to ingest or preserving in the repository is through membership. And currently we have 55 members and growing, and our latest member is the National Botanic Gardens of Ireland. So that's just a brief sort of summary of who we are and what we do. But as well as the act of preserving and stewarding objects, we also try to create co-created resources to speak to a variety of different constituents, be it community archives, be it institutional archives, be it people who have a very particular or niche archivable interest. We try to generate learning resources and materials that can really help guide others on their way and maybe put together some of the lessons that we've learned as an organisation. I'm sure everyone here in this digital room today knows that this is such a burgeoning field, ever changing. We're always grappling with new technologies, new methods, new artifacts to grapple with and ingest. So this is a really evolving field for us, and we really do like to try and contribute to the learning landscape as well. And with that in mind today, I'm just going to cover one of our learning resources that you can view in the repository, and Claire will offer some really practical examples of the use of the learning resource that we're profiling today. But essentially, what I'll briefly cover is information on cataloguing and organising digital and physical records, about providing clear, easy to follow and accessible instructions and advice for small organisations with limited resources. We know that time, money, limitations, staffing are such problems for often maybe volunteer-led organisations, and hopefully those issues have helped sort of cultivate the resources that we develop. And we also offer some advice on preserving a cross-section of digital records and organising materials in such a way that if you or your community group has the opportunity to deposit materials in a trusted digital repository, such as the Digital Repository of Ireland, that your collections will already be well organised and accessible and interoperable. So you've sort of done the legwork now to preserve for the future. So I'm going to just kick off with a scenario, if you can entertain me, if you will. Imagine that you are a member of a volunteer organisation that has worked out of one space, for example, a rented office, or in a lot of cases, the spare room of your house, for a number of years. You're faced with the requirement to move out of that office, and the space you're moving to has a quarter of the storage available than in your original office. So this really means that you're sort of forced into making decisions about what you're going to keep and what you're not going to keep in terms of your organization. You'll not be able to keep everything that you've amassed over the years, even the tea rota from the 1980s. It has to maybe go, unfortunately. But while moving, you do want to put some order into the many years worth of digital material you've amassed as an organization over the years in your shared cloud drive. So you'll not be able to keep everything, but what you do want to keep, you want to be sure it's organized and protected. So what can you do if you're faced with this kind of scenario? And you're maybe panicking, you've got maybe 2 months before you have to move out of your office space. There is actually quite a lot you can do in terms of organizing your digital materials. While a formal archive ordinarily needs to be managed by professionals, non-specialist individuals and groups can do a lot to ensure that personal or organizational collections are suitable for eventual archiving down the line. And we really just promote this appraisal technique, which I'm sure everyone is familiar with, but it's really these sort of four key components. What do I have? What should I keep? What should I get rid of? And then how should I store the things that I want to keep? So these appraisal principles are really your guiding force in making decisions as to the materials that you might like to have already organized and suitable for eventual archiving. Questions and issues to consider in terms of the types of records that you have. So you might have examples of physical records like leaflets, event materials, merchandise, printed press releases, or even artwork. We find we get a lot of things like artwork in, with our community archives in particular. Examples of digital records range from internal organizing documents, such as meeting agendas, minutes, and the all-important tea run, for example. Published materials such as reports, submissions, policy papers. Designed materials such as the logo for your organization, branding, poster and flyer design. As well as website content, such as blog posts, press releases, or even your websites themselves. One of the newest functionalities we have in the repository is the ability to actually preserve your website as a living object. So we can, on the 30th of November, go in, save your website, have it as a usable living object, and then that preserves sort of the brand, the identity, the news, the content of your community group or your volunteer organization as it was on the 30th of November 2024. And it's really interesting to see as we archive sort of some historical websites, maybe from the early 2000s, how we've evolved in terms of making websites and having usability and accessibility and even things like alt text. So it's really interesting to see how technology is catching up with our needs in terms of archival preservation. Specifically looking at business records, which can be quite tricky in terms of what do we keep, what don't we keep. Business records, of course, can be physical or digital. We may have only moved to using Microsoft Office, for example, in the last 25 or 30 years. A good rule of thumb in terms of your business records is that all organizational financial records should be retained for about 7 years after the financial year they cover. They can be destroyed after this point, although some organizations may wish to keep them longer. And this question about business records disposing of particularly sensitive material like financial records really intersects with governance issues as well and feeds into, I guess, the protocols and workflows you may have already established within your organization. If you're anything like me, the thought of throwing away financial records even after 7 years can send a shudder down your spine. So this is just important to note that it's a good rule of thumb, but ultimately you are the person who knows your archive best, who knows the business records you have best, and really having the autonomy and feeling empowered to make that decision is very much in your hands. Another rule that we really promote is this 3-2-1 rule. And by the way, folks, I'm really happy to share slides after this, so don't feel like you have to take any notes or anything. But this 3-2-1 rule, we find it a really useful standard for preserving and archiving digital material. So The principle is as follows. When you've got a digital object you want to preserve, say for example, digital finance records on a Word document or an Excel spreadsheet, we would say a good rule of thumb is to have three copies of this stored in different locations. So to apply the 3-2-1 rule with your Excel spreadsheet or your Word document, we would advise that you store one copy in a cloud program such as Google Drive or Dropbox, store a second copy on an external hard drive, and then a third copy on your own local drive. For example, the laptop you use day to day or your desktop computer. This 3-2-1 rule really does protect against maybe your computer being hacked or flooding in an office or a fire when maybe your external hard drives could be a danger. There's a wee community group in County Tyrone where I'm from, and they were had all the Gaelic football records and programs and all these fantastic artifacts from years gone by. And sure, wasn't there a terrible flood about 3 years ago? And they really lost a lot of important material. So when we talked to them about the 3-2-1 rule, it was like manna from heaven almost to future-proof all the materials that they had and that they'd saved. And while it maybe seems a little bit nebulous, 3-2-1, let's have in these on all these different places, you're really backing up and ensuring that the materials you have are going to be as well protected as you possibly can be for as little expense as well. So it is very important to think about, the decisions that you're making as well. Like why, for example, explaining why you chose maybe Dropbox over Google Drive, the rationale for having the external hard drive located in your organization's safe, the code for the safe, and then even passwording and protections for your own laptop or desktop computer. And this is really important as well to have those kind of advice notes so that people who come after you in the organization will have this information, that they will know that Maeve back in 1990 decided that the new Apple Mac was the perfect place to store the materials. Unfortunately, it's all on a floppy drive. So 25 years later, she put it on Google Drive and kept a hard copy on the laptop as well. So even just to constantly update your protocols, I know it sounds very dry, but it is the kind of future-proofed activity that means that if the worst does happen down the line, you have the instructions. It's not just the responsibility of one person taking on all the stress of doing this kind of preservation work and developing these workflows. And it really will inform how your organization manages its records, in a really confident way as well. So I've touched a wee bit about this with my County Tyrone GA Club horror story, but storing 101 really we would say for your physical records, and I'm sure many of you are already aware of these tips, but storing in acid-free boxing or foldering, and I don't know about yourselves in Scotland, but here in Ireland, a lot of the local councils would have initiatives where they would provide free boxing and free foldering for community groups so that they can get their hands on these quite specific materials at archiving kind of meetup days, or good quality folder boxes, just a good old box file for short term. As well as that, keeping materials somewhere cool, dark, and dry is so important. I don't know if any of you are fans of The Rest is History podcast, but I was listening to a piece on the Library of Alexandria a few weeks ago. And, we hear so much about its destruction and sort of the end of intellectualism before the Dark Ages. But more often than not, they think that because so much of the content in the Library of Alexandria was on paper, and even though it was stored, very carefully over decades, this paper and papyrus began to rot. So, we really have to learn from our past and really do our very best to keep our physical records as dry, as cool, as protected as possible. In terms of your digital records, we would always suggest storing material in your repository, like us at the DRI, using cloud or hard drive software, Lacy or G technology, and try to have duplicates so that you're not putting all your eggs in one basket, and think about that 3-2-1 rule. And you can get all of this information in more detail in the little resource that we have. So I'm just going to fly through some tips on data protection as well, folks, because it's really important not to allow these acronyms and large terms to put us off, really doing sort of some of the important work that we need to do as regards privacy, and protecting our data and protecting our archival materials as well. So GDPR, it's really important to remember that it really only applies to data about living people. And it doesn't mean that your organization can't collect and keep personal data, just that there are limits to how long you can keep different types of personal data, and that there must be a justified purpose for you collecting the information. Where personal information has been destroyed, it should be shredded if physical or deleted securely. For example, deleted and removed from your computer, cloud, drive, trash. So again, it's almost the inverse of 3, 2, 1. Make sure you have removed it from all of the places that you've stored any data sort of relating to living people. There are two main types of information that are subject to data protection legislation, such as GDPR. This is personal data and special category data. Often these are the same kinds of data. So your personal data is any information relating to an identified or identifiable natural person. Examples are ID number, location, names, or factors relating to the economic and social identity of a person. Then special category data refers to data revealing, for example, racial or ethnic origins, political opinions, religious beliefs, trade union membership, or health data. So we can kind of segment them into these two particular kinds of data formats. So important to know as well that GDPR does contain a clause specifying that personal data can be kept for longer periods of time. By way of an exception, personal data may be kept for a longer period for archiving purposes in the public interest or for reasons of scientific or historical research, provided that appropriate technical and organizational measures are put into place, such as anonymization, encryption, etc. We would see a lot of this in materials in the repository that are maybe related to research projects. People might conduct interviews that then become data, or a journal article, for example, and they want to not only have the journal article in the repository, but also all of the supplementary learnings, for example, ethics protocols, the interviews themselves, the patient information or patient or person information leaflets. So all of that kind of information would really fall under these kinds of materials that can be kept for a longer time, as long as there are, specific reasons and organizational measures like anonymization or encryption put in place. In terms of your data protection policies, depending on how old your organization is, you might not have a formalized data protection policy. You might find that there are records of event attendance or membership going back many years. So what do you do if you have these kinds of materials in your archive or in your drawer of your office? The first thing really to do is decide what material is valuable from an archival point of view, even about maybe the history of your own organization. I think it's always important to think of ourselves as archivists of, certain topics, but also as our organizations as archival, and worthy of archival study as well. What will a person in the future, what will help them find out information about your organization and what it did? So once you've had a think about that, separated out your material, you should review the material to see if it contains personal data or special category data. And if it does, you can brief a data protection assessment. Again, this all sounds really dry and arduous, but what you're doing here by bringing in these protocols is protecting the materials that you have. You're future-proofing your organization, and you're making your own organization something that's going to be much easier to study and research by scholars and interested parties in the future. So when you're thinking about your data protection policy, you might think about deciding not to archive certain material and why you decided that. You might think about redacting personal data from material and then archiving it, or anonymizing personal data from material and then archiving it. And then you might consider leaving in personal data that is not immediately identifying. There'll be quite a few Maeve O'Briens in Ireland, for example, so there's maybe not too much problem with leaving in my first name, for example, in materials related to the Digital Repository of Ireland, or a local history thing that I might be interested in, for example. So I'm going to give you guys a second scenario just so that we can kind of think about this in practical terms. You're in your office, you're looking through your documents, and you find you have a document containing minutes for a public meeting held by your organisation several years ago. The minutes summarise what was said by members of the organisation and members of the public who were present. There's an attendance list containing people's full names. One sentence in the minutes identifies one of the named people attending the meeting as a member of a named trade union. So let's have a think about that. You've discovered this piece of information that includes both personal data, the names, and special category data, the individual's membership in a trade union. So one method of archiving this under GDPR, under that exemption, would be to redact or anonymize the personal and special category data. Another way is to get explicit consent from the person present to include their personal and special category data in the archived document. So both these approaches are compatible with GDPR. And this it really depends, I guess, on your capacity, because if you have a meeting, an important material of a meeting from the 1970s, that person, might be too old, you might have moved away. So if you can't actually get in touch and get that explicit content, you can do that redaction avenue instead. And you can sort of professionalize that by having these two strands within your data protection policy for your organization. And that really helps protect the data and ensure that you're treating your subjects with the utmost care and respect that you can possibly offer within the confines of your own capacity. So, folks, I just want to draw your attention to this resource that we have created at DRI. I've given you a whistle-stop tour of some of the content, but there are template ideas, more scenario examples, and other information in our guide to archiving digital records for volunteer and community groups. It'll give a lot more information on the cataloguing process, metadata, rights and licensing, permissions, and even developing finding aids for your own archives as well. Um, I've put the little DOI to the resource in this PowerPoint, and I'm more than happy to pop it into the chat as well, so you can have a wee look at it. And please do feel free to reach out to us if you've any questions, or if you want maybe this content of this delivered in a more precise way that relates to your own organisation. Don't hesitate to reach out. We'd love to hear from you. So I'll say thank you. I hope I haven't run too over time. And Claire, I'm happy to share slides for you if you would like.
Great.
Sorry.
I'm just going to pop in there and say, Claire, please carry on seamlessly, and we're going to take questions afterwards. So please do pop them into, I'm speaking to everyone on this call, please do pop them into the chat. You can ask them yourselves, or I can ask them for you. Okay, enough from me.
Okay, that's great. Well, thanks, Maeve. I'll just say to you when I need to go to the next slide. So Maeve has given a really good introduction to both DRI and this guide that was developed in recent years. So I want to talk a little bit about how in my work as a freelance archivist, I used content from that guide to help me with developing and archiving an oral history collection. So I work freelance. I have a company called Save Your Story. I work directly with small organizations like charities and local groups and community groups, helping them, basically kind of being the sort of the feature between them and a repository such as DRI, because a lot of small groups don't really have the means to engage directly, or if they do have the means, they don't have, or if they do have direct membership, they don't necessarily have enough staff to, or any staff a lot of the time, to do this kind of active digital archiving. So I'll just go to the next slide there. So in the last while, I have been working with Claire Memories / Cuimhne van Clár. It's a bit confusing that my name is Claire and I'm working with Claire Memories, but it's nothing to do with me personally. It's just a coincidence. The charity is working with local storytellers and people living in County Clare, older people especially, and is recording people and stories of an older time in Clare and safeguarding these stories in a publicly available archive. And they preserve life histories and folklore by training volunteers known as curatori, visitors, who visit people in their own homes in their communities to record their stories. Clare Memories has been working for some time now, and prior to it joining DRI as a member, it operated with a conventional kind of WordPress website and a lot of audio files, both stored, kind of uploaded to this website and catalogued quite well. And also kind of stored on drives and cloud storage and various things like that. On joining DRI, the organization wanted to have a more formalized approach to their archiving. They wanted all their as many of their oral history interviews as possible preserved for the long term in a digital repository. They wanted to record to preserve longer versions of oral history interviews, because a lot of what they had done in the past was record long interviews and then clip out sections to put together for brief radio spots or podcasts or things like that. But they still had the full interviews, which were just as rich and interesting. So the part of this job was to try and get as much of that stuff preserved, and alongside the preservation of these audio files and photographs as well, was the importance of having rich metadata to go with it, so that anybody who was browsing this collection on DRI would have a clear idea of the individual being whose interview was being preserved, what was discussed in the interview, and what was the subject terms that were relevant, and the areas and locations and various things like that. So the interviews that we get in Clare Memories tend to be with older people, so people who were born kind of between 1920 and 1940. They were mostly recorded maybe a decade ago, although some were recorded more recently. And the people would generally be from a rural farming background, although some are from towns and different backgrounds, as we'll see. And the interviews generally take the form of a kind of a life history. So the interviewer would ask the interviewer would ask the interviewee about their life, their childhood, their school days, traditions and folklore that they remember from their youth, music, sports, religion, community affairs, politics, anything really. And each person tended to have a slightly different focus, because they would have had slightly different experiences depending on their family background. So it's a very, very fascinating and broad range. There's obviously a kind of a stronger bias towards rural and farm life, as that's probably the dominant social setup in West Clare, especially in the west of Clare. But there were still people who, even within the farming, there was people who were tenant farmers, there were people who had larger farms, there were people who were more subsistence. So within all that, there is quite an interesting variety of different types of rural farming communities that are represented in these interviews. So I'll just pop along to the next slide there, Maeve. Thanks. So the collections that I've been most recently working on, so as I was saying, Clare Memories decided to join DRI to kind of get a bit more order. And then that's when they approached me, as I had previously worked with DRI. So I was very aware of how the repository was structured. And they engaged me to basically work as an archivist to collect the material that they gave me, sort through it, catalogue it. Plenty of it was quite well catalogued already, so that they had helped me at the start, and then create some collections on DRI itself. So what I did was I created a broad top-level collection simply called Cuimhne von Clare Memories, and then within that I created these sub-collections. There will be more to come, but this is the ones that are existing at the moment. And there was kind of four main categories that the interviews tended to fall under. So I divided them up, although plenty of them tend to be across two or more of these categories. But broadly speaking, there were stories, women's stories. So there's a very large number of fascinating, intelligent and funny women who spoke to curatori over the years. Some even took home recording devices and recorded their own memories themselves at home in little clips. Really interesting. So that's a very large and rich collection. The ladies you see in the interview were called Peggy and May, and they are best friends who did an interview together, which was enormously fun, but quite difficult to catalogue because they kept talking over each other and interrupting each other's stories and everything like that. But they were so full of life. Both are deceased now, but it was very, very lovely to hear their interview and to record it and to put it into the repository. The second one you see there is called Traditional Farming and Nature. So one of the kind of the focuses of the piece of funding that Clare Memories got to archive these collections was to look at questions about biodiversity and rural life. And one of the ways that the interviews reflected this, even though a term like biodiversity would not have been familiar to many of the people from farming backgrounds, but there was an understanding of an older form of farming that was more in tune with nature before there was more modern methods of farming. There was a very continuing theme of a type of transhumance like winter grazing, where certain cows were brought to a highland in the winter rather than summer grazing, which is the more common form of transhumance in farming. But in the Burren, because the Burren in West Clare is a very rocky limestone surface, so the ground tends to be quite poor, and there was actually better grazing to be got in winter on mountaintops. So many farmers or former farmers spoke about this practice and how they kept it going because it was actually more viable than buying in feed. It was cheaper than buying in feed. Excuse me. And the cattle, as a result, had unique strength and were very in demand from cattle buyers and ranchers across the country. There were other themes as well. There was talking about goats being raised, young goats being raised for an Easter dish, like basically raised to be slaughtered for Easter. There was themes about using turf or using manure as a form of fuel, drying out old forms of manure to use as tools, and using some plants for medicinal purposes. So those themes were extremely interesting. Then you see those towns and urban life. That was focusing on life in those towns around County Clare. There wouldn't really be any cities to speak of, but there would be towns of middling size. So there was quite a lot of interviews and people talking about recalling growing up in places like Ennis and Scariff and Killaloe, and the different businesses that were in these towns, the names of the businesses, the people who ran them, drapers, pubs, blacksmiths, wheelwrights, all these different kind of things, even some factories, creameries, butter makers. So that's a very broad and interesting. The picture you see there is from the town of Ennislyman in the 1950s, I think. And then the fourth collection you see there is Traveller Life. So Clare Memories focused on getting some collections from members of the travelling community, and they were lucky to get some wonderful interviews with some very interesting women, mostly, some men, but mostly women. And these interviews, in many cases, were also conducted by other travellers. So there wasn't a sense of an outsider coming in. So the courteur, the visitor in these cases, was another traveller, and they told interesting stories about their lives growing up around Clare and other parts of the country, since obviously they moved around a lot. And talked about traveling to different parts, like going towards the sea in the summertime and then moving more inland in the wintertime, going to different fairs and events, taking part in tinsmithing and working as farm labourers and raising children, and then travelling in these, as you can see, those particularly lovely round-topped wagons that were so popular back in the day, and then discussing the changes in their lives. And a common theme came up about even though many chose to become settled and to move into permanent homes, many bemoaned the loss of the traditional lifestyle that came with that. So there was kind of a mixed feeling about the past and the future. So it was they're extremely interesting interviews that are in that collection, and quite unique in many ways. I don't think we have many other examples of traveller oral histories spoken about by travellers themselves. So that's just quite quick overview of those. So in this case, I wanted to talk to you about how, when I was working with this material, what I was able to kind of glean from using this guide to archiving digital records that Maeve has just summarized so well. I'll just pop to the next slide there, please. So the broader theme of the guide, things like appraisal, I was fairly clear about what I wanted to preserve, because it was mostly kind of coming from Clare Memories, the organisation. So they would send me, this is what we want you to archive. So that was quite straightforward. It was useful to review laws about data protection when I was looking through not so much the interviews themselves, but the accompanying abstracts. So what Clare Memories, which is a very good system, I think lots of oral history groups could learn from this, was that for every interview, there would be a document accompanying it, which was basically like a kind of a running order. It would contain the name of the interviewer, the name of the interviewee, the location, the year the interviewee was born, where they lived, and then there would be a kind of a time stamped. There would be sections describing what was in each section of the interview. So from 0 to 13 minutes, they'd say Mary talks about her childhood in this place and growing up on the farm and a few details about that. And then from 13 minutes to 20 minutes, she talks about her neighbors and that continuing on like that. Very, very useful for researchers because then they can go through the abstract, see what they want to, if they want to listen to a particular subject, and then they can skip to that immediately in the audio rather than have to listen through the whole thing. So these abstracts were extremely interesting and useful. In most cases, they already existed. In some cases, I created them from using the same template by listening through to the audio and following the template. But the question that I got from when my clients in Clare Memories was that for data protection, do we need to excise personal information from these abstracts? And from reviewing the information here, I could see that in most cases that wasn't necessary. The interviewee's name didn't need to be redacted because in nearly all cases, Clare Memories, the curatori are given a consent form, which they bring to the interviewee, and they describe the process by which they're going to take this interview, and it's going to be made available. And it's like it wasn't going to be DRI then because that wasn't a feature, but it was known it was going to be archived and publicly available. So the interviewee was aware that this was kind of for the public as opposed to a private conversation, and their name being attached to it was not kind of it was already they had given consent for that to happen. So that personal data was explicitly permission had been granted to keep that and publish that personal data. We did decide, however, that in cases where occasionally an abstract would contain a phone number or it would contain a very detailed address, like down to the house number, and while in most cases this was not particularly violating a huge amount of privacy, we thought it was better policy to just redact phone numbers where they appear. We also had to keep in mind that in many cases these interviewees are deceased, but sometimes the phone number would be of their next of kin, like a son or a daughter who had linked them up with the interviewer, because obviously in many cases they were quite elderly. So when we weren't too sure about whether the phone number attached to a living or a dead person, we said we will just decide to redact it. So using the guide and discussions with Clare Memories, we said we'll do that. But the other information, also the other relevant information, the year of the person's birth, which again is personal data, because they had given consent in the interview to speak, and because part of the point of the interview was that they were a person of a certain age who had memories of a certain time, the year of birth was not seen as data that needed to be redacted or anonymized. It was personal data for which the consent had been given to preserve and to make available, and it was relevant to the particular interviews. So the person's name and their year of birth was generally not seen as a problem. Occasionally, with some interviews, an interviewee would speak about a person who was living and maybe be a little indiscreet about them. And in those cases, Clare Memories already had a policy of simply clipping out anything that could potentially, in those cases, obviously data protection is important, but it's really more about ethics and community harmony and not creating a situation where somebody is like, why is that person complaining about my mother, blah, blah. So this actually happened very rarely. People were usually quite not particularly voluble about anything that they shouldn't talk about, but occasionally here and there might be a mention of something that was a little sensitive. So from an ethics point of view, it was agreed that we would clip that out and just use the audio without that, and the abstract would also reflect that as well. But in most cases, that was not something that was relevant to our problem. The people mentioned people by name a lot, but it was usually to talk about this man was a great fiddle player, this man was a great dancer, this woman was, you know, a great concertina player. It was very much like describing people's qualities. And again, it was relevant to the research. So we're talking again about the archiving exemption also mentions public interest and research. So information about people, most of whom were deceased anyway, but even if they were living, was perfectly justifiable as far as I was concerned anyway. So I'll just pop to the next slide. So the other theme that we discussed that I used the guide to kind of help me along with was the question of rights and licensing. So obviously, as those of you who work as archivists are aware that copyright is a very important issue when it comes to trying to make material available. In DRI, the default is to try as often as possible to use open licenses such as Creative Commons. So basically, the copyright holder gives permission for the material to be made available on an open license so that it can be reused and republished as long as the creator is given attribution, so basically credited for what they have created. The copyright is always going to remain with the creator. In terms of oral histories, generally speaking, the organization or person who conducted the interview is broadly speaking the copyright holder, although sometimes it can be a little ambivalent, but broadly speaking, the organization is the copyright holder. So in this case, it was Clare Memories were the primary copyright holder. The consent agreement also made that clear, the consent agreements with the interviewees. It didn't mean that the person who gave the interview had no sort of rights over anything they gave in their interview, but it was just for clarity's sake, the copyright holder was Clare Memories. So in that case, that was clear. In some cases, as I'm sure some of you have found in your own archive, if you're working with community groups, it can be very confusing. You're like, I don't know who made this, and I don't know if they when it was made and who made it, and if they'd be willing for it to be republished. Some cases it's kind of seen as not particularly important, but technically speaking, you do need to have a clear idea of who owns the copyright of something that you want to make publicly available in an archive, and to have some kind of agreement with that individual or some kind of blanket agreement as an organization, which is actually one of the recommendations in the guide for an organization to sit down together and agree on a common license that's going to apply to all your material across the board. So in my discussions with Clare Memories, I had a preference for Clare Memories to agree to a Creative Commons license for all their material and to have that be applied across the board. And there's a variety of licenses. There's some of them that are more restrictive than others. However, if you just pop to the next slide, we'll kind of see what we ended up with. So Clare Memories were open to the idea, but did point out that they already had a kind of a rights statement that they had developed in consultation with some of their interviewees and some of their stakeholders. And they were more comfortable with sticking with that, which is basically an all rights reserved with a rights statement. So it's not quite as open as a Creative Commons, in the sense that a Creative Commons license means that anyone can pop along and just use it without having to go in and ask for, specifically go and ask for permission to use it. Whereas in this case, somebody would be obliged to contact Clare Memories and ask if they could reuse it. So it wouldn't have been my preference, but obviously I was deferring to what the client wanted, and it's still clear and it's still within copyright legislation. It makes sense. It's reasonable. It makes sense within the repository as well. So we compromised on that. And that was a good example of basically I was able to use the guide to kind of make my pitch for Creative Commons, but also kind of reflect on the guide's kind of understanding of how copyright law works. Actually, I was mentioning to the organizers at the start of the event that I've been talking about GDPR and copyright legislation, and I think a lot of you are in the UK, but data protection legislation in the UK is pretty similar to GDPR. They haven't really changed drastically as a result of leaving the EU, and copyright legislation in Ireland and the UK is pretty much identical. So even though I'm speaking about different legislation, a lot of this is going to apply to what you're doing as well, with the caveat that obviously we check your own jurisdiction's legislation, but just to flag that. So I'll just pop along to the next slide there, please. So the final thing that I wanted to mention that I used the guide for was that there's an appendix at the end that kind of gives advice and guidance on how best to catalog, basically naming conventions for cataloging files. So what you do in the repository is that you name you name your physical files, like your digital audio files, in a particular way that use the same file name, and then you have a sequence of numbers, and that enables a batch ingest process. And that name sequence, the part before the numbers, so you can see it there on the right, that is also the same file name as the metadata file, which is an XML file full of all the information that tells you everything about the particular object. So basically, the information that was given in the appendix helped me to kind of think about how I was going to name these in a way that made logical sense both to me and also to Claire Memories and to even a person browsing who wanted to download these files. So you can see I just used something quite standard. I used C&C, which is abbreviation of equivalent von Claur. And then OH is for oral history, because there'd be other types of material. And then I simply use the interviewee's name, and the home rex is referring to the fact that these are home recordings. In most cases, it just is the interviewee's name. And then, as you can see, there's a numbered sequence. And as you can see in the Appendix 7 clip on the left, it basically gives an example of how you might go about naming a sequence of digital files, which is not just for ingest and DRI, this is just for cataloging in general. And it gives an example which says, gives the hypothetical files names like abbreviations, ARC, and numbering 001 to 009, and then gives lists of metadata files like creator, organization name, date range. So that was like, while it wasn't an exact map, it was a very kind of useful thing to look back. I was like, how would I go about naming this in a way that's simple and consistent and makes sense? And the appendix in the guide helped me a lot with that. So I'll just pop along to the next one there. So I'm just going to talk very briefly. I won't go into this too much detail, just basically, this is kind of not really from the guide, but this is probably might be relevant to some of the local history materials that some of you work with. These are some of the Library of Congress subject terms that I used. I did a big deep dive into Library of Congress subject terms, and I got lots that were relevant to this particular collection, you know, the oral history in West Clare and Ireland. And I reused a lot of them, and I used some of them for specific interviews where they're relevant, and some of them I, you know, spread across other ones. And the great thing about them is that they're both searchable within the repository. You can write in a search term, but also if you are looking at an object which has one of these search or these subject terms, if you click on the subject term, they're clickable, it will call up every other object, not just in that collection, but in the whole repository that also uses that search term. So it's lovely and standardized. It's the kind of the tidy part of my mind really appreciates it. So that was something that did quite a lot of initial work and research, but it has saved a huge amount of work down the line because it means I have this lovely set of standardized terms that I can use across the board. So I'll just pop along to the next one. I think I have some. Yeah, I just wanted to show you. Basically, this is how, you might have seen this already, but this is how the collection looks. So you can kind of see how, if you go to DRI, you can see that how the top level collection appears when you're just browsing it. And you can see that under description, there's a fairly detailed piece of information about Clare Memories as an organization and a kind of a summary of what's within it. And then if you just pop to the next slide, that shows you how the material, how if you go into a sub collection, for example, in this case, women's stories, you can see individual interviews, and the interviews have the person's name, it has a photograph, and it has, you can see the subject terms appearing underneath the photographs. So it has those kind of consistent subject terms that I mentioned earlier. So that's really just kind of like a visual if you were browsing at that, and then you could click into each one of those and you could listen to the audio, look at the photographs, download the audio file, anything like that. And we'll just click on again. Yeah, this is a nice example of an individual object. And this is, so basically a big part of this project was trying to have the descriptions be as detailed as possible so that the metadata is useful to a person just browsing this and who wants to find interviews about certain topics and certain subjects. So I use the abstracts, which are quite detailed, to inform these descriptions. So you can see in this case that I describe a little bit about the interviewee, where she's from, when the date of the interview, her date, her year of birth, and talk about her, like mention that the song that she sings and talk about the name of the song, and then a few other little bits of information that she talks about in terms of doing a play about Biddy Early and rural electrification. So all these different themes are kind of mentioned. It's not like, it's not describing it blow by blow, but it's giving you enough information that if you're browsing and you're looking through it, and I think, from the guide, which did advise as rich metadata as you have time to do, which, isn't always the case. In many cases, if you're pressed for time, you don't have time to write something this detailed. But if you do, it's always really good for future researchers. So just pop to the next one there. So yeah, just basically the benefits for, this is kind of outside the remit of using the guide, but just as generally, basically the kind of the pitch that I would have made to Clare Memories to how it would benefit them to have their collection preserved in DRI in this way. So as I mentioned, the subject terms linked to other collections in the repository. It's an equivalent of Unclar promoted within DRI's network. It can be aggregated to Europeana. And then of course, their material is safely preserved for the long term, and they still have their own copies. They can still have their own website with access to audio, all the rest of it. It's kind of preserved in the long term. So that's everything. I think I have a last slide with just a few little links on it, but yeah, I have a website there, email and LinkedIn, and it's been really nice talking to you, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you guys might have.
Thank you both very, very much. I'm looking at the time and we are sort of running out of time. So what I maybe want to ask Maeve and Claire is, when we send out the recording, would you be happy for us to include your email address and if people
Sure.
wanted
Yeah,
to
no problem.
contact
Yeah.
you? So that's great.
Absolutely, folks.
I'm just going to ask one question that's come in because I thought it was quite interesting. And it was, if you redact personal information, do you then destroy the original?
If you redact personal, no. Well, what you do then is it creates, usually what it tends to do is it creates a new file with redaction in it. And yeah, if I was saving it as, I'm trying to think how I've done it in the past. Usually I have created a new file and then yeah, deleted any. What I might have done is that I would have turned something into a PDF with the redaction in it and then deleted the original Word document. It's not really the preservation of the personal data in and of itself in these cases is not necessarily an issue in the long term, especially as I was saying, so many of the subjects are deceased. But for my own, on my own system, I would be in the habit of deleting the original without the one that didn't have the redactions in it.
Okay. No, thank you. I believe Maeve has answered Deirdre's question in the chat, which everyone can see about software, if that is helpful. So I'm going to say the next question, which I think Rebecca's asked if I can ask, is, can I ask Claire why she would prefer Creative Commons?
A lot of it's familiarity. I'm just used to it. Used it for a long time. It's certainly not the only type. There's other open license systems out there. I'm trying to remember what the one, the OD something or other. It's very commonly used open licensing system. It's Creative Commons, I suppose, is just one of the more widely used ones. It's built into things like Google search. You can filter for Creative Commons images. And it's quite simple and easy to use, but it's certainly not the only. I mean, somebody can just simply say, I make my material, like there was a musician, Tom Lehrer, who just made all his songs completely. He just wrote a big long statement saying, I renounce all kind of rights over this. It's royalty free, whatever. Anyone can do whatever they want with it. And in theory, he didn't have to do that. He could have just applied a CC0 license. But for whatever reason, sometimes somebody might prefer to kind of make a detailed statement. So it's certainly not obligatory, but from a convenience point of view, I find it the most useful.
Okay. We've got 1 minute left. Claire, I'm going to ask for a very brief answer to this, and then maybe we could get Ben, who's had his hand up. But it is actually about the use of your underscores when you're actually cataloging. You've seen that. just very busy. Does it some affect in any way the sort of searchability of
Not
the?
really, because the file names are actually not really what it the if you go to DRI and write something in the search box, it's not looking at the file names, it's looking at metadata, and that will have a person's name with the space. So it'll be analyzing metadata for the search terms rather than the file names are kind of not quite in the background, but they are in it. They're more about like this is the asset tools, this is where the assets are stored. So it doesn't really affect it. I would say if you're creating metadata, yeah, I wouldn't advise like putting words like names together like that. Obviously, space them out. But for file names, with the DRI anyway, it doesn't make a difference. It's the metadata that's important.
Okay, thank you. Ben, would you like to unmute and ask a very, very quick question because then we'll finish.
Sure. I'm from Hertfordshire County Archives, and just again on archiving of personal data. I thought it struck me that Maeve's interpretation of GDPR was quite stringent, and that the UK National Archive guidance states that personal data worthy of permanent preservation should be safeguarded by record keepers until it's archived. And sort of the problem is not having the data; the problem is publicizing it. And we frequently see organizations, community organizations who give us their data, and it can be gutted sometimes because that they've felt that they have to destroy anything relating to anyone's name. And I would hate for anyone to go away from this presentation with that impression. It's like you don't have to destroy that data.
Yeah. Like it's really important to emphasize like you are allowed to keep personal data. And that's like we're kind of like GDPR is probably slightly stricter in that regard, but it's certainly not intending to kind of block the keeping of personal data. And like you said, the publicizing is different to the keeping. I think it's more like what its original function was and the expectations of those who provided it in the first place, as which was again something I touched on when I was talking about the consent agreements. But like that is so important because there is so much over interpretation of data protection legislation, for people to basically think that you're not allowed to keep anything ever, which couldn't be further from the truth.
Yeah. Maeve, any comment just following that up?
No, not at all. It's absolutely important to have that perspective as well.
Okay, great. Well, listen, I think we're going to have more questions. I can see that coming in the chat, but we will be sending out Claire and Maeve's email address. I'm sure they'll be very happy to answer any of your questions, and you're also going to receive the recording. I just want to say thank you very much to Maeve and Claire for really, really interesting talks. I also think I want to echo what Rebecca Marr has said, that they are incredibly clear and helpful for people who are wanting to do very similar things to what you've been doing, Claire. And I think everyone's going to be downloading that directory, your guidelines. Maeve, looks an amazing document. So thank you both very, very much. And I hope to see some of you next Tuesday for our last webinar when we look at funding for these digital programs. Okay, thanks very much and bye.
Thanks, folks.
Bye.
Bye.